The man responsible for killing a Washington County deputy is himself a former deputy. A judge set bond at $2.5 million for Mitchell Rubel late this afternoon.
Good afternoon and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you're new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. As always, if you could give this video a like and comment with your thoughts down below, that would be much appreciated as it helps the channel to grow. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and click that red button because I make more content like this, and hit the little bell icon so you get notified when I post. Today we're discussing 4 more recently solved decades-old cold cases. Let's get into it. It was February 7th, 1981 in Marietta, Ohio, when Lieutenant Joe Clark was enjoying an evening in with his wife. The 49-year-old police officer had served the Washington County Sheriff's Office for 14 years and was considered a passionate and dedicated officer. He was in the middle of a big case. He had been tasked with tackling a growing drug dilemma in the area. An article had just been published that morning where he'd given an interview to a reporter discussing his plans to begin disrupting drug operations in the area by making several arrests in the coming days. He had anticipated it was going to be a busy week. He and his wife Patricia were enjoying the calm before the storm and watching a basketball game together. Joe gets up and heads to the kitchen for a top-up of snacks for the two of them. He had only been gone for a moment when Patricia heard what she believed was an explosion in the kitchen. There had been tinkering of broken glass, and she had thought a light bulb had exploded. Following the sound of the glass breaking, there was a loud crash in the kitchen. She ran to the kitchen and found Joe collapsed on the floor. She didn't understand what had happened, but had assumed that Joe had had a heart attack initially, but noticed a pool of blood beginning to spread from her husband. Paramedics arrived and confirmed that Joe had been fatally shot. Officers quickly arrived on the scene. One of their own had been ambushed in their home, and it almost seemed unbelievable. The detective assigned to the case secured the crime scene and began a preliminary investigation. The Clarks' kitchen faced their backyard with a window directly in front of where Joe had collapsed. The window was nearly missing its entire glass pane, and on the ceiling there were what appeared to be shotgun pellets. They checked the backyard near a tree. There had been several military boot-style shoe impressions facing the home. Also found was a number 4 buck shotgun shell. Someone had targeted Joe. They lied in wait until he came into the kitchen and shot him. Initially, it was believed to have been connected to Joe's work uncovering the local drug operations. That same evening, another murder had taken place, and it was a small-time drug dealer. Officers thought the 2 murders must have been connected. Maybe the murdered drug dealer was believed to be an informant for Joe. It seemed more than a coincidence.
It was basically horror for a while because you have the number 2 law enforcement officer in the county shot and gunned down in his home.
Witnesses in Joe's neighborhood also gave an important lead. A blue Ford Pinto was seen parked near the Clarks' home. It had been idling for a long while. Nearly 10 separate witnesses said they saw a man in the driver's seat, but no one could get a good look at him. Several known individuals involved with the drug trade were all brought in and interrogated. They had been able to determine what had happened to the drug dealer, but no one interviewed knew of Joe Clark, or who would have wanted him murdered. Without finding any additional leads, the case went cold. In November 2012, the Washington County Sheriff's Office had extra time and resources in their budget and decided to establish a dedicated cold case unit. The case that took the top of the list was Joe Clark's murder, now over 3 decades cold. Detective Jeff Severs took over the case and started from the beginning. They went back to the home Joe Clark had been murdered in. Although the property had changed owners several times, the home had never undergone any major structural remodels, and it was very similar to how it had been in 1981. They brought in some high-tech lasers and were able to exactly pinpoint where the shooter had stood, 31 feet from the window. Knowing the exact distance had been important. From there, they shot off a range of different types of shotguns to replicate the same damage that had killed Joe. They had been able to narrow it down to one specific weapon, a particular shotgun that was standard issue for law enforcement and military personnel. This narrowed the scope of their investigation greatly. Joe Clark had been well liked at the sheriff's office. He worked hard, he was a good cop who played by the rules, and was well liked by those who worked with him.
He was just a good guy to be around. He was a true professional. He was a law enforcement officer. He was very good at what he did.
However, there had been an incident in 1981 that may have made him an enemy. Back before Joe's murder, a deputy arrested a burglary suspect. The suspect would not confess and continued to maintain his innocence. The deputy then packed him into a squad car, drove him to a secluded area, and beat him until he confessed. The deputy then packed him back up, brought him back to the county jail, and started the paperwork to process the confession. The suspect told other officers what had happened, and it launched an investigation into the deputy, who had not only gone against what was legally allowed as a police officer, but was also so beyond the scope of excessive force. Joe Clark had been the lead on that investigation, and had been directly responsible for that deputy being fired. The deputy in question was Mitchell Rubel. Rubel had come from a long line of decorated police officers and military men. He himself had served in the Vietnam War. He had felt it had been his destiny to follow in their footsteps, but he didn't have the same dedication that other officers had. He was willing to color outside the lines of what was allowed as a member of law enforcement to get results. The worst kind of cop, the one who didn't feel that the rules didn't apply to him.
Rubel had been fired by Joe because excessive use of force while he was on duty.
He had not taken the firing well. No one else was willing to hire an officer that had been fired for excessive force. He would later find work as a corrections officer at the Noble Correction Institute, where he worked for 25 years. It was also discovered that in 1981, he also had a blue Ford Pinto, but it had been registered in his wife's name, and he also had the same shotgun registered to him as well. Rubel was brought in for questioning and had produced an alibi. He said that he'd been with a man named Tom Smith all night. Officers then went to Todd Smith and brought him in for questioning. Smith confirmed the alibi, but hadn't been able to remember details exactly. Officers knew there was more to the story, but Smith wouldn't talk. Eventually, Smith was offered an immunity if he was honest about the events that had happened 3 decades prior. With immunity paperwork signed, Smith started from the beginning. He said that evening he'd been home when Rubel knocked on his door. Rubel wanted a gun that he had been storing at Smith's home. He gave him the gun and said that Rubel asked him to drive him somewhere. Smith did, while Rubel instructed him where to go. Then he parked the car and Rubel got out with a shotgun. He had been the driver that witnesses had seen idling in the neighborhood that night, while Mitch Rubel had waited for Joe to come into the kitchen. Smith said that he waited in the car for a long time. He'd lost track of time and had started freaking out. He heard the shotgun shot and Rubel got back in the car and they went back to Smith's apartment. There, Rubel left the gun with him and threatened to kill him if he ever said anything to anyone. Detectives, now confident that Rubel was a suspect that had murdered Joe Clark back in 1981, wanted the final nail in the coffin. They wanted the weapon. They tracked down Rubel's Air Force buddies and one by one interviewed each of them, asking each of them if they had ever bought a gun off of Mitch Rubel. The last man on the list said that he had, and he was able to hand over the shotgun to law enforcement. They were able to match the gun to the shell and pellets recovered from the crime scene and positively identified the gun as the same weapon that had killed Joe Clark. Mitchell Rubel, at 64 years old, was arrested on September 9, 2014 for the murder of Joe Clark in 1981.
Wife had a Piteau, 72 Piteau. Did you ever buy any number 4 box?
Oh, yeah. Bought it, dropped tons of it, so.
Where'd you buy it at?
Probably Lane Sporting Goods.
What'd you use it for?
Coyote hunting, well, it wasn't coyote hunting, whatever.
He may have been anticipating the arrest because when officers were executing a search warrant for his home, they had found dozens of illegal handmade explosives, in addition to a modified AR-15 fully automatic rifle and several hand grenades. The explosives and illegal weapons added 7 more felony counts. He was found guilty on March 11, 2016, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison on March 18, 2017, apparently dying in his sleep of natural causes. On September 24, 1996, 21-year-old Priscilla Lewis was working her shift as a waitress at the Four Corners Pizza and Pasta restaurant in Croquette, California. It was the last time her cousin, Troy Kinslow, saw her. I was across the street at the bar drinking and had seen her on her break. And the next morning, I went to the store to get something to drink, and a friend said, "Have you heard about her?" Around 10:30 p.m., just before the restaurant closed, the cook went into the basement, which was shared with other tenants of the Valona Square Mall and accessible to the public. There, in the ladies' bathroom, he found Priscilla's body. She had been beaten, strangled, and left with her face in the toilet. Her cause of death was ruled asphyxia due to drowning. Priscilla's murder was Croquette's sole homicide case that year, and the tragedy shook the small community. They rallied together by plastering the area with posters pleading for information, distributing buttons with her photo on them, and offering an information reward that totaled nearly $60,000. The Contra Costa Sheriff's Office interviewed dozens of people during their investigation, analyzed numerous pieces of evidence, and served several search warrants to no avail. The case went cold and stayed that way for over 2 decades. In 2020, investigators submitted additional crime scene evidence to the Sheriff's Office Crime Lab to test using their advanced DNA technology. Finally, they found a match for the suspect, Danny Lamont Hamilton. Hamilton's DNA was already in the database due to his criminal record. At the time of the discovery, he was already incarcerated for unrelated sexual assault charges and was serving a 295-year prison sentence. On December 8, 2021, Hamilton was charged with 1 count of murder as well as murder by lying in wait, felony kidnapping, felony burglary, and an enumerated sex offense. Priscilla Lewis is remembered as a perky, hardworking young woman who could light up a room with her presence. Her best friend described her as a great, kind person and a fighter.
There had to be DNA under her nails. She had to have fought back. Whether she knew the person or not, there's absolutely no way that she didn't fight for her life.
Though it took over 2 decades to identify and charge her killer, Priscilla's cousin, Troy, said it's brought some semblance of closure.
When something happens and it's been this long, it's closure for me. It doesn't bring her back, it'll never bring her back, but for me it's closure.
A Jane Doe from Yonkers, New York has finally been identified after almost 30 years. On June 27, 1992, a construction worker found the dismembered remains of an unknown woman in a dumpster behind the I Love New York pizza parlor. Authorities identified Jane Doe as a victim of serial killer Robert Schulman, who was active in the area at the time. However, the identity of the victim remained a mystery for many years. In 2018, the Yonkers Police Department appealed for more information about the unknown woman. They didn't have much to go off. She had a butterfly tattoo on her shoulder and scarring that suggested she had at least 1 child. They drew a blood sample, but they couldn't connect it to a name. They also knew she was a sex worker, which fit Schulman's MO. He confessed to killing 5 women who worked in the sex industry and scattered their remains throughout Long Island and Manhattan. Schulman was eventually sentenced to life in prison for his crimes and died in 2006. Decades later, the police were still determined to uncover the victim's true identity. Detective John Geese said,
"I don't care what a person is or what they do, they're a human being, and her name wasn't Jane Doe."
The FBI then provided the Yonkers Police Department with the genetic genealogy technology that would change everything. They submitted Jane Doe's DNA into private genealogy websites, and after just 3 weeks, they found a match. It was a cousin of the victim. From there, they were able to finally identify Jane Doe as 31-year-old Marissa Hammonds of New Jersey. Marissa was born in Kentucky in 1961, was one of 7 siblings, and later became a mother of 2. She lived in California and Michigan before landing in New Jersey, and was working as a fashion model with her sister. Authorities confirmed the DNA match by testing a sample provided by her siblings and now adult son, Jason D. Trapani. Before the identification, Jason hadn't known his mother's family. Now they are a beloved part of his life. In a message on Facebook, he wrote, "Love every single one of the Hammonds family. Truly grateful to have found you. Better late than never." Orange County's oldest Jane Doe case has been closed after DNA testing identified both the victim and the killer. In 1968, a woman's body was found by 3 young boys playing in a farm field in Huntington Beach, California. The victim had been sexually assaulted, severely beaten, and her neck had been slashed. She also appeared to have been pushed out of a vehicle before being left for dead. Police scoured the muddy field for evidence and found tire tracks, clothing, and a cigarette butt, which they carefully preserved. They conducted an exhaustive number of interviews during their investigation and followed up on leads but could never identify the victim or her killer. Earl Robitaille was the commander of the Huntington Beach Detective Bureau at the time. He said police were sent on a wild goose chase after forensic dentists told them that Jane Doe's dental work was probably done in Mexico, which threw the investigation off. In 2001, the case was reopened and investigators extracted DNA from the victim's sexual assault kit as well as clothing, from which they developed a profile for an unknown male. 9 years later, a partial male DNA match was obtained from the cigarette butt found at the crime scene. It was consistent with the DNA from the sexual assault kit, but the suspect still couldn't be identified. Then the Huntington Beach police turned their focus on identifying the victim. In 2011, they collected a partial DNA profile from blood collected from the victim's blouse. The profile was entered into the FBI's DNA index system, CODIS, for a familial match, and her fingerprints were entered into the Cal ID system, but there were no results. In 2019, Huntington Beach detectives joined together with the Orange County District Attorney's Office to solve the case. By using investigative genetic genealogy, they established a possible family tree for the suspect based on the DNA profile they'd developed, and identified the alleged killer as Johnny Crisco. Crisco was 28 years old at the time of the murder and was not identified as a suspect during the initial investigation. He had been discharged from the Army after failing a psychological test that had diagnosed him with aggressive reactions, being quick to anger, and being impulsive. He died in 2015. In early 2020, detectives, prosecutors, and forensic scientists started building Jane Doe's family tree. Former homicide detective Pat Ellis, who worked on the case since 2010, was about to retire. But before he did, he ordered a retesting of Jane Doe's clothing, and they got a DNA hit. They called in Colleen Fitzpatrick, a renowned genetic genealogist, who used the DNA profile to build Jane Doe's family tree until they found a living relative named Steve Sabo. A detective then reached out to Steve to see if he knew any missing relatives. Steve was able to find a clue in an obituary of a distant cousin, Constance Saucier, which read, "Connie was predeceased by her parents, her sister, Teresa Piteau Gallagher, her brother Robert Piteau, and her sister Anita Piteau, missing since 1970. Detectives then used familial DNA analysis to positively identify Jane Doe as 26-year-old Anita Louise Piteau. Anita was born in Augusta, Maine on March 9, 1942. In 1967, Anita and some friends left Maine for Southern California in search of a different life. In letters to her family, she wrote about working as a waitress and visiting Hollywood, where she toured stars' homes. She said she'd be coming back home in May. But then the letters stopped, and her family never saw or heard from her again. Anita's niece, Lori Quiron, said, "We never in our wildest dreams thought that they were looking for her. That they were working on this case for that many years just blows my mind. I just thought we never knew what was going to happen to her. For over 50 years, Anita was buried in an unmarked grave in Newport Beach as a Jane Doe, but in the summer of 2020, she was transported to her final and rightful resting place, in a family plot in Watersville, Maine, with a stone marker that reads, "We miss you."
Our detectives went last weekend and took remains back to Maine and had a private burial service with the family so that they could properly say goodbye to their sister that they hadn't seen for 52 years.
Well, that is it for this video. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content and subscribe for more if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to turn on that notification bell so you get notified when I post. And if you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership as well as Patreon to get early access, members only content, live streams, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box, as well as links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.